Diagnosed with an incurable disease, a reclusive magnate makes an unlikely promise to a street girl. What happens next challenges everything science believes to be possible. The silence of the doctor's office weighed more heavily than all the business decisions Edward Barrett had made in 3 decades. At 58, the billionaire had always known that time was money, but he never imagined that the day would come when not all his empire could buy him a few more months of life. The numbers on the tests were relentless, as cruel as the financial statements he used to analyze with cold detachment. "A rare disease, Mr. Barrett," the doctor repeated, nervously adjusting his glasses. "Experimental treatments offer little hope of reversal. We have to be realistic about the prognosis." Edward fixed his gaze on the office window, watching the movement on Fifth Avenue. Down below, people hurried along, each carrying their own burdens, oblivious to the fact that on the 12th floor, a man had just discovered that his existence had an expiration date. He had always controlled everything around him, from the smallest details of his companies to the people who were part of his life. Now, for the first time, he felt completely helpless. In the following weeks, Edward disappeared from the routine that had defined him for decades. He cancelled important meetings, delegated strategic decisions, and informed the specialized press that he was on a retreat to rethink corporate directions. The truth was quite different. Locked in his penthouse on the Upper East Side, he spent his days trying to process what it meant to have an announced end. Sergio Mendes, his former partner and current interim manager, called daily with market reports and urgent company matters. Edward listened to everything with a detachment he had never imagined possible. The numbers that once fascinated him now seemed like meaningless scribbles. What did a multi-million-dollar merger matter when his body was starting to fail? What good was all that wealth if it couldn't buy what he needed most? It was Joe Charles, his driver of 15 years, who suggested the trip. A simple and observant man, he had noticed how his boss was wasting away within the marble walls of the penthouse. "Boss, you need to breathe some other air. How about we visit some towns in the countryside? It always did you good when you were younger." Edward didn't remember doing that when he was young, but the idea of escaping New York City seemed appealing. The next day, they set off without a definite destination on Interstate 80, heading into rural North Carolina. Edward hoped that the change of scenery would help him think more clearly about how to organize the coming months, perhaps the last months of his life. The landscape gradually changed. Mirrored buildings gave way to mountains covered in dense forest, and the car's air conditioning couldn't mask the smell of damp earth that seeped through the cracks. Edward felt weaker each day, but there was something comforting in that green vastness that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was when they were crossing a particularly isolated region that the car began to have problems. Joe Charles tried to accelerate, but the engine coughed like a dying patient. "Boss, I think we'll have to stop. The car isn't doing well." "Not doing well," Edward repeated with bitter irony. At least they had something in common. The car finally stopped a few miles ahead, near a faded sign that announced Harmony Creek 3 km. Joe Charles examined the engine and concluded that a mechanic would be needed. After a few calls, he discovered that the only professional in the region was attending a festival in town and would not return until the next day. "We'll have to spend the night here." "Boss," Joe Charles informed him, visibly concerned about his boss's reaction. To his surprise, Edward merely nodded. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps the acceptance that not even his schedule was under his control anymore. They carried their essential luggage and walked down the dirt road that led to Harmony Creek. The town greeted them with its disarming simplicity. Modest houses lined unpaved streets, and a central square housed centuries-old trees that offered generous shade. There was a small white-walled church, a bakery exuding the aroma of fresh bread, and a few shops selling the necessities for local life. Edward felt transported to an America he thought no longer existed. The inn was simple but clean. Mrs. Matilda, the owner, welcomed them with typical country cordiality. Asking no questions about who they were or where they came from, Edward settled into a small room with a window overlooking the square, and for the first time in weeks, managed to fall asleep without the aid of medication. The next morning, he woke up with a strange sensation. The constant pain he felt in his chest seemed to have diminished slightly. He went down for breakfast and found Joe Charles talking animatedly with other guests about football and politics. Edward sat at a table near the window, and observed the movement in the square. It was then that he saw her. A girl of about 10 years old was playing near the fountain in the center of the square. She wore a simple blue cotton dress and worn sandals, but there was something in her posture that drew attention. She didn't play with the frantic energy of other children, but with a serenity that contrasted with her age. Her brown hair was tied up loosely with a red ribbon, and her dark eyes observed the world around her with intelligent curiosity. Edward finished his coffee and went out to walk around the square. The movement tired him more than he expected, and he sat on a wooden bench under a leafy tree. Breathing was difficult, and he closed his eyes, trying to catch his breath. "Are you sick, sir?" The sweet voice made him open his eyes. The girl was there, a few feet away, looking at him with an expression of genuine concern. Edward was surprised by the direct question, but also by the absence of fear or malicious curiosity he usually found in people's eyes. "Why do you ask?" he replied, trying to sound less debilitated than he felt. "Because you look tired." "And sad too," she said, coming closer. "I'm Annie. I live here with Mrs. Geraldine." Edward studied the girl's face. There was a maturity there that didn't match her apparent age, as if she had already seen more of life than many adults. "And you, what do you do when people are sick?" "Sometimes I pray for them," Annie replied naturally, as one might talk about the weather. "Mrs. Geraldine says sometimes it helps. Can I pray for you, sir?" The question caught Edward off guard. For decades, he hadn't heard anyone mention prayer so simply and sincerely. In his world, people spoke of strategies, investments, financial returns. No one offered prayers as if they were the most natural thing in the world. Something broke inside him at that moment. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps the certainty that nothing could worsen his situation. The words came out of his mouth before he could think them. "If you cure me, I'll find your parents." Annie looked at him with confusion. "My parents?" Edward realized he had said something she didn't fully understand. "You don't live with your parents?" "No, sir. They left when I was a baby. Mrs. Geraldine raised me." The girl spoke without sadness, as one reporting a known fact. "But I don't know how to cure people. I only know how to pray." "Then pray," Edward said, surprising himself with his own response. Annie placed her small hand on his shoulder and closed her eyes. Edward didn't know what to expect, but he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. A human presence genuinely concerned about his well-being, wanting nothing in return. When the girl finished her silent prayer, she opened her eyes and smiled. "There, I'll pray more tonight before I sleep." Edward watched her walk away, skipping between the uneven cobblestones. A promise had been made, and for the first time in his life he didn't know if he would be able to keep it. But something inside him had changed in those few minutes. Perhaps it was just the fresh country air. Or perhaps it was something his rational mind couldn't comprehend. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us from which city you are watching us, we continue. Edward woke up the next morning with a feeling he hadn't experienced in weeks. The chest depression, which had become his constant companion, seemed to have diminished overnight. He sat up in bed slowly, waiting for the usual morning dizziness, but it didn't come. For a few moments he remained still, trying to understand what was happening to his body. He went down for breakfast in the small dining room of the inn and found Joe Charles reading a local newspaper. "Good morning, boss. Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Edward replied, noticing that his voice sounded clearer than in recent days. Mrs. Matilda served fresh coffee, sugar bread, and aged local cheese. Edward, who for weeks had barely been able to swallow a few spoonfuls of soup, found himself eating with appetite. The simple taste of those foods awakened something in his memory, echoes of a distant childhood when things didn't need to be sophisticated to be good. "Has the mechanic arrived yet?" he asked Joe Charles. "Not yet, boss. Old man Jenkins said he'll show up after lunch. It seems the part we need isn't available here in town. It'll have to come from Asheville." Edward nodded, but to his own surprise, the news didn't irritate him as it normally would have. There was something about Harmony Creek that made him slow down, as if time followed different rules there. He decided to walk around town while he waited. The dirt roads led to small shops that told the story of generations of families. At James's bakery, a burly man with a grizzled moustache, Edward was greeted with the typical small-town curiosity, but without intrusion. James offered him freshly brewed coffee and began to talk about Harmony Creek with the pride of someone born and intending to spend their entire life in the same place. "Here, we've known each other since childhood, Mr. Edward," James said, using his first name with familiar country warmth. "Everyone looks out for everyone else. It's not like those big cities where nobody knows their neighbor." Edward was surprised to find himself genuinely interested in the local stories. James spoke about traditional festivals, about the families who founded the town, about young people who left to study and returned to raise their children in Harmony Creek. It was a completely different world from his own, where success wasn't measured by financial achievements, but by the quality of relationships and peace of mind. "And the girl, Annie?" Edward asked, trying to sound casual. James's face lit up. "Ah, our Annie is special. Mrs. Geraldine found her when she was a tiny baby, abandoned at the church door. We never knew who her parents were, but Geraldine raised her as her own daughter. The girl has a heart of gold. She's always helping everyone. Helping how? In every way, you know. She takes food to those in need, stays with the elderly when they're sick, plays with the younger children. And there's something special about her, you know. People just feel better when she's around." Edward absorbed the information in silence. There was something in James's description that echoed what he himself had felt the day before. He paid for his coffee and continued his walk, absorbing the details of a life that operated in slow motion compared to his previous routine. In the central square, he found Annie again. She was sitting under the same tree where he had rested the day before, but this time she wasn't alone. 3 younger children surrounded her, and she seemed to be telling a story. Edward approached slowly, curious to observe the dynamic. "And then the little bird told the girl that he knew where the treasure was," Annie narrated with expressive gestures. "But she replied that she didn't need treasure, because she already had everything she wanted, a family that loved her." The children listened fascinated, asking questions about story details. Edward noticed that Annie wasn't just telling the story, but creating it as she spoke, adapting to the reactions of her small audience. When the story ended and the children dispersed to other games, Edward approached. "Interesting story," he commented. Annie smiled, recognizing him immediately. "Hi, Mr. Edward. How are you feeling today?" The question caught him off guard again. "Actually, a little better," he admitted. "That's good. I prayed a lot last night, as I promised." She studied him with those dark, mature eyes. "You mentioned yesterday about finding my parents. Why did you say that?" Edward felt a lump in his throat. How to explain to a child that he had made a desperate promise, born of fear and irrational hope? I don't really know why I said that. Sometimes people say things when they're scared." "Were you scared, sir?" "Very scared," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. Annie nodded as if she understood perfectly. "Mrs. Geraldine says that when we're scared, it's good to talk to God. He always listens, even when we think he doesn't." Edward sat on the bench beside her. "And do you talk to God?" "Every day, especially when someone needs help." She swung her legs, which didn't reach the ground. "But I don't know if I could find my parents, even if I wanted to. Mrs. Geraldine says they went to a very faraway place." "Do you miss them?" Annie considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I'm curious about what they were like, if I take after one of them. But Mrs. Geraldine is my real family. She taught me everything I know." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Geraldine, an elderly woman with white hair tied in a bun who called Annie for lunch. Edward observed the interaction between the two and noticed the genuine love that existed there. It wasn't a situation of charity or obligation, but a family bond built on mutual choice and daily care. "Mrs. Geraldine," Edward said, standing up politely. "I'm Edward Barrett. I'm staying at Mrs. Matilda's inn." The lady greeted him courteously, but Edward noticed a penetrating gaze as if she was trying to decipher who he really was. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Edward. Annie told me you weren't feeling well." "I'm better today," he replied, realizing he wasn't lying. "That's good. Harmony Creek has a gift for healing what afflicts people. Sometimes what we need is just a quiet place to think." Mrs. Geraldine smiled, but her eyes remained alert. "Do you plan to stay here long?" "It depends on when we can get the car fixed." "Sometimes cars break down when we most need to stop," the lady commented wisely. "Come, Annie, lunch is getting cold." Edward watched them walk away, noting how Annie held Mrs. Geraldine's hand with absolute confidence. There was a lesson about family there that all his years of business success had not taught him. He returned to the inn with firmer steps than he'd had in weeks. During lunch, Joe Charles commented that he seemed to have more energy. "The country air really does you good, boss. You should come here more often." Edward agreed, but he knew it wasn't just the country air. There was something more, something his rational mind struggled to accept, but which his body seemed to be recognizing. The hours he had spent with Annie the day before, her simple prayer, the promise he had made. Was it a coincidence that his improvement began exactly after that moment? In the afternoon, while resting in his room, Edward picked up his cell phone and, for the first time in days, checked his emails. Dozens of messages from Sergio Mendes, all with increasing tones of concern and irritation. The last one, sent that morning, was more direct. "Edward, I need to know where you are. Investors are asking questions. This cannot continue." Edward typed a quick response. "I'm fine. I just need a few more days." Sergio's reply came almost instantly. "A few days for what?" "Edward, you're worrying me. This isn't like you." He looked out the window, observing the peaceful movement in the square, and realized that Sergio was right. This wasn't like him. The Edward Barrett of 2 weeks ago would never disappear without leaving detailed instructions, would never entrust important decisions to others, would never allow himself this reflective pause. But perhaps that was exactly what he needed, to discover who he was when he stripped away all the layers of control and power he had built around himself. He turned off his cell phone and went down to the square. Annie was there, as if waiting for him. The days in Harmony Creek began to follow a rhythm Edward never imagined adopting. He woke up without an alarm clock, had coffee at the inn watching the square's activity, walked the streets talking to residents, and always, invariably, met Annie at some point during the day. Each morning brought a feeling of well-being that seemed impossible, considering his medical diagnosis. On the 5th morning, Edward decided he needed to better understand what was happening. If his improvement was real, he couldn't simply ignore it. And if it had any relation to Annie, as his rational mind struggled to deny, then his promise to find her parents gained a weight he could no longer ignore. He sought out Mrs. Matilda in the inn's kitchen. The owner was preparing dulce de leche and greeted him with the maternal smile that had already become familiar. "Mrs. Matilda, can I ask you some questions about the town?" "Of course, Mr. Edward. What would you like to know?" "About the girl Annie. James told me she was found as a baby at the church door. Do you remember that time?" Mrs. Matilda's face tightened slightly, as if she was choosing her words carefully. "It was about 10 years ago. A very sad case. The little child was in a basket with a note, but nothing that identified the parents." "And no one ever investigated?" "Never tried to find out who the parents were." Mrs. Matilda stopped stirring the candy and looked at him directly. "Mr. Edward, you're a good person, I can see that. But why so much interest in our Annie?" Edward realized he had hit a sensitive spot. In small towns, any excessive curiosity about a child would be viewed with suspicion, especially from an outsider. He needed to be careful. "She helped me when I was feeling unwell. I became curious about her story," he replied, trying to sound natural. Mrs. Matilda nodded slowly. "Mrs. Geraldine did try to find out, yes. She went to Asheville, spoke with social workers, checked with the police station. But there was no record of a missing baby, no family looking. It was as if the girl had appeared out of nowhere. And the note? What did it say?" "It asked them to take good care of her, that the parents couldn't keep her, but that they loved her very much. Mrs. Geraldine kept the paper, if I'm not mistaken." Edward absorbed the information. There was something strange about that story, gaps that his mind, trained to detect inconsistencies, could not ignore. Babies don't just appear without a trace, especially not in an era when medical records and births are carefully documented. "Where is the town's registry office?" "We don't have a registry office here. The closest one is in Stonehaven, about 40 kilometers from here." "But why all the curiosity?" Edward invented an excuse about being interested in local history and left the inn with a clear mission. He needed to check Annie's official records. If he was going to keep his promise, he needed concrete information. He found Joe Charles at Old Man Jenkins' garage supervising the car repair. The mechanic, a thin man with hands permanently stained with grease, informed him that the part would only arrive the next day. "Boss, are you in a hurry to leave?" Joe Charles asked. "Because frankly, I've never seen you as well as you are these days." It was true. Edward felt more energetic than he had in months. Breathing was easier, his appetite had returned, and even his complexion seemed healthier. By the medical standards, he knew that should be impossible. "Joe, I need you to take me to Stonehaven this afternoon. I have some information to verify." "Of course, boss. We'll borrow Mrs. Matilda's car." On the trip to Stonehaven, Edward pondered how he would explain his search for information about a child. He decided to be direct. He would say he was considering financially assisting the family and needed to verify the documentation. The registry office was an old building, with archives dating back to the beginning of the last century. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Applegate, was helpful, but the information she found was discouraging. "There's no birth record for any Anne or Annie in Harmony Creek in the last 10 years, she informed him after carefully checking the files. "There's an Anna Beatrice born 12 years ago, but her parents are known, they still live there. And records of abandoned or informally adopted children. That would be complicated, sir. Informal adoption doesn't generate an official record. And if the child wasn't registered at birth," Mrs. Applegate shook her head, "it would be as if she didn't officially exist." Edward felt a chill in his stomach. "What do you mean, didn't exist?" "Without a birth certificate, a person can't get documents. Can't study, can't work legally, can't even travel. It's a very delicate situation." The implication hit Edward like a punch. Annie, that special girl who had touched his life so deeply, technically didn't exist under American law. She was an invisible citizen, entirely dependent on Mrs. Geraldine's goodwill and the informal protection of the Harmony Creek community. "And what would be necessary to regularize such a situation?" he asked. "It would be necessary to file a lawsuit, prove the abandonment situation, have witnesses. It's complicated and expensive. Most simple people can't afford that." Edward thanked her for the information and left the registry office with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in days. Now his promise gained a dimension he hadn't imagined. It wasn't just about finding Annie's parents out of curiosity or gratitude, but about resolving a situation that could affect the girl's entire future. On the way back to Harmony Creek, he stopped at the only place with internet in the region, an internet cafe in Stonehaven. Using his laptop, he began a broader search. He looked for records of missing babies in North Carolina 10 years ago, cases of abandonment, families who might have lost a child. It was then that he found something that made his heart race. A newspaper article from 10 years ago reported the disappearance of Helen Christine Miller, 19, who was 8 months pregnant when she left home after an argument with her parents in Charlotte. The family had launched several search campaigns, but she was never found. The article included a photo of the young woman, brown hair, dark eyes, features that Edward immediately recognized. Annie had the same eyes as Helen Christine. Edward printed the news and other related information. There was more. Helen was the daughter of Charles Miller, a textile businessman, and Lucy Miller, a retired teacher. The couple had lost contact with their daughter after an argument about her early pregnancy and had spent years looking for her. And the grandchild they never got to know. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made Edward's heart beat faster. What if Helen had given birth somewhere near Harmony Creek? And what if, for some reason, she couldn't keep the child and had left her at the church door? And what if the parents Edward had promised to find were not only alive, but desperately searching for news of their daughter and granddaughter for a decade? He returned to Harmony Creek, with his head buzzing with possibilities and implications. He found Annie in the square as always, but now he saw her with different eyes. In the delicate features of her face, Edward could imagine the faces of the grandparents who might never know she existed. "Mr. Edward, you look different today," Annie observed. Did something happen? Edward sat beside her on their usual bench. "Annie, if I told you that maybe your grandparents are alive and looking for you, what would you think?" The girl's eyes widened. "My grandparents? It's possible. Only possible, I'm not sure yet. But if it were true, would you like to meet them?" Annie remained silent for long moments, processing the information. "And Mrs. Geraldine, would she still be my family?" The question touched Edward deeply. Even faced with the possibility of finding her biological family, the girl's first concern was for the person who had raised her with love. "Of course she would," he replied. "Family isn't just who gave birth to us, but who raised us with love." Annie nodded slowly. "Then I would like to meet them, yes, but you have to promise you won't forget Mrs. Geraldine." "I promise," Edward said, and for the first time since making his initial promise, he felt he was on the right path to fulfilling it. That night, as he prepared for bed, Edward realized that his motivation had completely changed. He was no longer trying to fulfill a desperate promise made out of fear of illness. Now he genuinely wanted to help that extraordinary girl discover her origins and ensure she had all the opportunities she deserved in life. And for the first time in years, Edward Barrett felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with money or power. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us from which city you are watching us. We continue. Edward spent the entire night awake, staring at the ceiling of the small inn-room. The information he had discovered about Helen Christine Miller spun in his mind like pieces of a puzzle that was almost complete, but still hid fundamental aspects of the story. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't physical pain that kept him awake, but the urgency of a decision that could forever change the lives of many people. At dawn, he made a decision. He dressed early and sought a location with better cell phone signal, climbing to a small hill on the outskirts of Harmony Creek. With the number he had found in the internet records, he dialed the Miller family residence in Charlotte. The voice that answered was feminine, mature, tired. "Hello? Good morning. I would like to speak with Mrs. Lucy Miller. This is she." "Who's calling?" Edward took a deep breath. "My name is Edward Barrett. I'm calling about your daughter, Helen Christine." The silence on the other end of the line was so long that Edward thought the call had dropped. When Lucy spoke again, her voice trembled. You have news of Helen. Please tell me she's okay." "Mrs. Miller, I need to be careful with what I'm about to say. I don't have certainties yet, only suspicions. But I believe I may have information about your granddaughter." This time the silence was followed by a muffled sob. "My granddaughter? Helen had the baby? Where is she? Where are they?" Edward closed his eyes, realizing the magnitude of what he was doing. "Mrs. Miller, may I suggest we talk in person? I'm in a town called Harmony Creek in rural North Carolina. Would it be possible for you and your husband to come here?" "We'll leave right away," Lucy replied without hesitation. Charles, come here. Someone has news of Helen." Edward heard agitated voices on the other end of the line, a quick conversation between the couple, before Lucy returned to the phone. "Mr. Barrett, we'll leave Charlotte today. Can you give us the exact address?" Edward provided the inn's information and arranged to meet them in the late afternoon. After hanging up, he remained for a few minutes on the hill, watching Harmony Creek awaken to another peaceful day. In a few hours, that peace would be tested by the arrival of people carrying 10 years of pain and hope. He went back down to the town and went to look for Mrs. Geraldine. He found her in her simple house, a white-painted adobe construction, with a yard full of flowers and a small vegetable garden. Annie was helping to hang clothes on the line, humming a children's song. "Mrs. Geraldine, I need to talk to you about Annie," Edward said, trying to control the anxiety in his voice. The lady studied him with her keen eyes. "Annie, dear, go play out front for a bit. I need to talk to Mr. Edward." When they were alone, Mrs. Geraldine crossed her arms. "You can speak, Mr. Edward. Ever since you arrived here, I've noticed you have some special interest in the girl. I hope it's for noble reasons." Edward told her everything, his promise, the investigation, the discovery about Helen Christine, the contact with the Millers. Mrs. Geraldine listened in silence, and her face gradually grew serious. "And now they're coming here?" she asked when Edward finished. "This afternoon." Mrs. Geraldine stood up and walked to the window, watching Annie play in the yard. "I always knew this day might come," she finally said. "All these years I've prayed for God to give me the strength to do what was best for her, not for me." "You're not angry?" "No, Mr. Edward, perhaps even relieved. Annie deserves to have a complete family. Opportunities I could never offer, but..." Her voice faltered for a moment. "She is everything I have. She's my daughter in my heart." Edward felt a lump in his throat. "Mrs. Geraldine, nothing needs to change drastically. Even if we confirm that the Millers are her grandparents, you will still be her family. She will just have more people who love her." The conversation was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of a young woman Edward didn't know. Tall, with curly hair tied in a ponytail, she carried a camera and a determined expression. "Excuse the intrusion," she said, addressing Edward and Mrs. Geraldine. "My name is Julia Anderson. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm investigating some reports about special events that supposedly happened here in Harmony Creek." Edward felt his blood run cold. "What kind of events?" "Unexplained healings. People who came to town sick and left better. I'm trying to verify if there's any factual basis for these stories." Julia looked directly at Edward. "You wouldn't happen to be Edward Barrett from Barrett Investments?" The question caught Edward completely off guard. "How did you—" "I did my research. A billionaire who mysteriously disappears from his companies is seen in a small country town, and suddenly stories about miracles circulate." "It's an interesting story." Julia smiled, but there was determination in her eyes. "Would you like to talk to me about your experience here?" Edward looked at Mrs. Geraldine, who seemed as surprised as he was. "I have nothing to declare," he said. "I understand. But you know the story is already spreading, don't you? On social media, in WhatsApp groups. It's only a matter of time until other journalists arrive here. Perhaps it would be interesting for you to tell your version before others tell it for you." At that moment, Annie appeared running in the yard. "Mrs. Geraldine, there are some strange cars in the square with big antennas." "What's happening?" Edward and Julia exchanged glances. "Other journalists," Julia murmured. "I got here first, but not for long." The situation was spiraling completely out of control. In a few hours, the Millers would arrive for a meeting that could change Annie's life forever, and now the press was discovering the story. Edward realized that his attempt to keep everything discreet had completely failed. "Julia," he said, trying a diplomatic approach, "if you really want the true story, give me a few hours. Important people are arriving, and after that I can talk to you properly." "What kind of important people?" "Possibly Annie's family." Julia's eyes lit up with journalistic interest. "The girl who supposedly performs miracles. She has family?" Edward realized he had said too much. "Julia, please. These are people who have suffered a lot, looking for a child for 10 years. Let them reunite with dignity before turning this into a public story." Julia considered the proposal. "All right, but I want exclusivity in covering this meeting. And then you tell me your whole story." It was a dangerous bargain, but Edward saw no alternative. "Agreed, but with total discretion during the meeting." Julia agreed and walked away, but Edward knew the agreement was fragile. Journalists had their own pressures and deadlines, and the story of a billionaire cured by an orphan girl who finds her family would be irresistible to any media outlet. Mrs. Geraldine had followed the entire conversation with growing concern. "Mr. Edward, what a mess you've brought into our peaceful life." "Mrs. Geraldine, I'm so sorry. I never imagined things would escalate like this. And now? How will I explain to Annie that suddenly she's going to have grandparents, journalists, and who knows what else?" Edward looked at the girl, who was playing oblivious to the approaching storm. "We'll talk to her together. She deserves to know the truth before other people start telling distorted versions." They called Annie and sat in the small living room of Mrs. Geraldine's house. The girl watched them with curiosity, sensing the seriousness of the moment. "Annie," Edward began, "do you remember when I said I might be able to find your family? Well, I believe I've found your grandparents. They're coming here today to meet you." "Really?" she asked, her eyes shining with emotion and fear at the same time. "Yes, my dear," Mrs. Geraldine confirmed, taking the girl's hand. "But I want you to know that no matter what happens, you will always have a home with me." Annie hugged Mrs. Geraldine and then turned to Edward. "Mr. Edward, you're really keeping your promise." Edward felt a pang in his chest. "I'm trying, Annie. But I need to warn you that other people have learned about the story, and journalists might come here. Things might get a little confusing. Why do journalists want to talk to me?" Edward and Mrs. Geraldine exchanged glances. How to explain to a 10-year-old child that the adult world was fascinated by the possibility that her prayers had healing powers? "Because you're special, my child," Mrs. Geraldine finally said. "And sometimes people are interested in special people." Annie nodded, accepting the explanation with the simplicity of children. But Edward saw in her eyes a maturity that worried him. That extraordinary girl was about to be exposed to a world that might not understand or respect her innocence. The rest of the afternoon passed in growing tension. Edward saw more cars arrive in town, some clearly from the press. Curious residents began to gather in the square, whispering among themselves. The inn's phone rang constantly, with Mrs. Matilda having to deal with calls from journalists wanting reservations or information. When the miller's car finally arrived at 5 in the afternoon, Harmony Creek had completely lost its usual tranquility. The couple who stepped out of the black sedan seemed to carry on their shoulders the weight of an entire decade of hope and despair. Charles Miller was a man of medium height, graying hair and shoulders bowed by age and pain. Lucy, his wife, had the same dark eyes Edward had recognized in Annie, but framed by wrinkles that spoke of sleepless nights and silently shed tears. Edward awaited them at the inn's entrance, accompanied by Joe Charles. He had asked Mrs. Geraldine to keep Annie at home until he was sure how to proceed. The meeting between people who might be family needed to happen with the utmost care. "Mr. Barrett?" Charles asked, extending his hand with evident nervousness. "Yes, it's a pleasure to meet you both in person." Edward shook the couple's hands, noticing how they trembled. "I know it's been a long and emotionally difficult journey. Would you like to rest a bit before we talk?" "No," Lucy replied immediately. 10 years was rest enough. Please tell us everything you know." Edward led them to a private room in the inn, where Mrs. Matilda had prepared fresh coffee and homemade cookies. Julia Anderson sat discreetly in the corner, honoring the agreement to observe without interfering, but Edward could feel her presence as a constant pressure. "First of all," Edward began, "I need you to understand that nothing is certain yet. I have suspicions, indications, but no definitive proof." Charles nodded. "We understand. Just tell us what you discovered." Edward recounted his arrival in Harmony Creek, his encounter with Annie, the circumstances of the girl's abandonment, and finally his research that had led to Helen Christine's story. With each word, he watched the couple's faces transform, passing through hope, pain, anxiety, and something that seemed to be recognition. "Do the physical characteristics match?" Lucy asked, her voice choked. "Her eyes are identical to yours," Edward replied, "and there are other features that—" "Well, I believe you yourselves will be able to assess." "We want to see her," Charles said. "Please." Edward hesitated. "There are some complications I need to explain first." He told them about the arrival of the journalists, the growing interest in the story, the possible implications of making the situation public. "We don't care about journalists," Lucy said firmly. "If she's our granddaughter, if she's our Helen's daughter, nothing else matters." It was then that Mrs. Matilda entered the room, visibly agitated. "Mr. Edward, excuse the interruption, but more people are arriving. Big cars with equipment, and there's a man outside asking for you, says he's your partner." Edward felt his stomach sink. Sergio had arrived. "I ask you to excuse me for a few minutes," he said to the Millers. "There's an urgent matter I need to resolve." At the inn's door, Edward found Sergio Mendez accompanied by 2 men in suits, probably lawyers or security guards. Sergio was visibly irritated and worried. "Edward, what the hell is going on here?" Sergio said bluntly. "You disappeared for days, don't answer calls properly, and now I accidentally discover you're at the center of a crazy story about miracles and mystic healings." "Sergio, this isn't the time for this conversation." "This isn't the time?" Sergio raised his voice. "Edward, you are the main shareholder of a business conglomerate. Your reputation affects hundreds of employees, thousands of investors. And you're here playing saint?" Edward looked around. Several people had approached to hear the discussion, including local residents and some journalists with cameras. The situation was turning into a public spectacle exactly when he most needed privacy. "Sergio, give me an hour. Just 1 hour and then we'll talk about everything." "An hour for what?" "To do the right thing." Sergio studied him with narrowed eyes. "Edward, if you've lost your mind, I'll have to take drastic measures to protect the company. And you know, I have legal backing for that." The threat was clear. Edward nodded. 1 hour, Sergio. That's all I ask." He went back inside the inn where he found the Millers standing anxious. "We could hear the argument outside," Charles explained. "We imagine you have your own pressures to deal with this." "Yes, but nothing that can't wait. You've come a long way for a meeting you've waited 10 years for. Let's go to Mrs. Geraldine's house." The walk through the streets of Harmony Creek to Mrs. Geraldine's house was like a procession watched by dozens of curious eyes. Residents peeked from windows. Journalists walked at a respectful distance but recorded everything. And Edward felt the weight of responsibility for the circus he had unintentionally created. Mrs. Geraldine greeted them at the door with Annie by her side. The girl wore her best dress, a light blue one with small embroidered flowers, and her hair was carefully combed. But it was her face that drew attention, a mixture of curiosity, nervousness, and an impressive maturity for her age. The first glance between Lucy Miller and Annie was electrifying. Lucy brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes immediately filling with tears. "My God," she whispered. "Charles, look at her eyes." Charles was paralyzed, watching the girl with an expression of shock and recognition. "Helen," he murmured. "She looks like Helen when she was that age." Annie looked at the strangers with curiosity, then turned to Edward. "Mr. Edward, are they my grandparents?" Edward knelt down to the girl's height. "Henny, these are the people I believe to be your biological mother's parents. They've been looking for you for a very long time." Lucy stepped forward, trying to control her tears. "Darling, may I come closer?" Annie nodded, and Lucy approached slowly, as if fearing the girl would disappear if she made sudden movements. When they were face to face, Lucy whispered, "You have your mother's eyes, and your grandfather's smile when he was young." "Did you know my mother?" Annie asked. "She was our daughter," Charles replied, his voice broken by emotion. "Her name was Helen Christine, and she disappeared 10 years ago when she was expecting you." Annie absorbed the information with the seriousness Edward had already learned to recognize in her. Where is she now?" It was the question everyone feared. Charles and Lucy exchanged glances, and Edward realized they didn't have that answer either. "We don't know, darling," Lucy admitted. "We hoped you could help us find out." "I don't remember anything from before living with Mrs. Geraldine," Annie said honestly. Mrs. Geraldine, who had observed everything in silence, finally spoke. "Sirs, perhaps it would be better if we talked more calmly. This girl is special, but she is also a child who has been through a lot. We cannot overwhelm her." It was then that Lucy did something that surprised everyone. Instead of addressing Annie first, she walked over to Mrs. Geraldine and hugged her. "Thank you," she said, openly crying. "Thank you for taking care of our granddaughter when we couldn't. Thank you for loving her." Mrs. Geraldine returned the embrace, and Edward saw tears in her eyes too. "She is a blessing," the lady said, "and she will always be welcome in this house no matter what happens." Charles approached Annie slowly. "May I ask you a question, darling?" Annie nodded. "Do you have anything that belonged to your mother? Any object that was with you when you arrived here?" Annie looked at Mrs. Geraldine, who nodded encouragingly. "I have a small bracelet. Mrs. Geraldine said it was on my wrist when they found me. May I see it?" Annie ran inside the house and returned with a small golden bracelet with a heart-shaped charm. Charles examined it carefully, and Edward saw his hands tremble. "Lucy," Charles called his wife, showing her the bracelet. "It's the bracelet we gave Helen for her 16th birthday." Lucy looked at the object and broke down in tears. "It's hers. It's our Helen's." The confirmation brought a mix of joy and pain that Edward could physically feel in the air. There were the grandparents finding the granddaughter they had searched for 10 years, but still without knowing the fate of the daughter they loved. Annie watched the adults with a wisdom that transcended her age. She approached Lucy and placed her small hand on her shoulder. "Don't cry, Grandma. I pray for Mom every night, even without knowing who she was. I'm sure she's okay." The word Grandma had a transformative effect on Lucy. She stopped crying and smiled through her tears, gently hugging the girl. May I give you a grandma hug?" she asked. Annie smiled and allowed herself to be embraced. Edward watched the scene and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of having done something genuinely good in the world. But the tranquility of the moment was interrupted by loud voices outside. Julia Anderson, who had discreetly recorded everything, approached Edward. "There's a problem out there," she said. "Your partner is arguing with other journalists, and the situation is getting heated. I think you need to make a decision about how to handle the public exposure, because this won't stay a secret for much longer." Edward looked out the window and saw Sergio gesticulating irritably at a group of reporters, while television cameras were being positioned in the square. Harmony Creek had turned into a stage, and they were all main actors in a drama that was completely escaping his control. "Mrs. Geraldine," he said, "do you have a more private place where we can continue this conversation? Because I think our time for privacy is rapidly running out. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us from which city you are watching as we continue." Mrs. Geraldine led the group to the back of her property, where there was a small porch protected by a glass roof and surrounded by a flower garden. There, away from curious glances and cameras, the newly reunited family could finally breathe and process the historic moment they were experiencing. Annie sat between Lucy and Mrs. Geraldine, as if symbolically connecting her biological family to the family that had raised her. Charles remained standing, clearly emotional, holding Helen's bracelet as if it were an invaluable treasure. "There's something else you need to know," Lucy said, addressing Annie. "We brought some things of your mother's." She opened a bag and took out a photo album. "We wanted you to see what she was like." The album pages revealed a young Helen at different moments of her life, a smiling child, a rebellious teenager, a dreaming young woman. In all the photos, the features Edward had recognized in Annie became even more evident. "She liked to draw," Charles recounted, showing a photo of Helen painting in the yard. "And she sang very well. She always said she wanted to see the world." "Why did she leave?" Annie asked with the natural curiosity of children. Lucy and Charles exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. "We had an argument," Charles admitted. "When we found out she was expecting you, we were worried. She was very young, and the baby's father, well, he had disappeared when he learned of the pregnancy. We said things we shouldn't have," Lucy continued with remorse in her voice. "We were scared, we wanted to protect her, but she interpreted it as rejection. One night she left home and never came back." Edward was observing the conversation when his cell phone vibrated insistently. It was Sergio, probably pressing for an answer. But there was another missed call that caught his attention, from Dr. Henry Parker, his doctor in New York City. Discreetly, he returned the call. "Dr. Parker?" "Edward." "Finally got through to you. I have the results of your latest tests, the ones you took before you left. There's something extraordinary I need to tell you." "What happened?" "Tell your disease markers. Edward, they are drastically decreasing. In 15 years of practice, I've never seen anything like it. It's as if your body is regenerating in a way that medicine cannot explain." Edward felt the world spin around him. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. I want you to come back to New York City immediately for new tests. But from the numbers I have here, you've not only stabilized but are heading for a complete recovery." Edward hung up the phone with trembling hands. The medical confirmation of what his body had been signaling in recent days was both an immense relief and a revolution in everything he believed about life. He returned to the group, who were still leafing through Helen's album. "Excuse the interruption," he said, "but I just received some important medical news." Everyone looked at him expectantly. Edward took a deep breath. "My illness seems to be regressing inexplicably." Annie smiled as if the news was the most natural thing in the world. "I knew the prayers were working." Lucy looked at her granddaughter in astonishment. "Do you really believe your prayers cured Mr. Edward?" "I don't know," Annie replied honestly. "But I believe that when we ask for help with sincere love, sometimes we receive more than we expected." It was at that moment that Julia Anderson appeared on the porch with an urgent expression. "Excuse me for interrupting, but you need to know what's happening out there." "What now?" Edward asked, fearing the answer. "Your partner is giving interviews. He's saying you've had a nervous breakdown, that you're being manipulated by charlatans, and that he's going to permanently take control of the companies." Edward felt anger rise in his chest. He stood up, determined. "Where is he?" In the square, surrounded by journalists. Edward walked towards the door but was stopped by a small hand that held his sleeve. It was Annie. "Mr. Edward, remember what Mrs. Geraldine always says? That people act badly when they're scared." Edward looked at the girl, then at Mrs. Geraldine, who nodded encouragingly. "He's afraid of losing something important to him, just like you were afraid when you arrived here." The wisdom of that child struck him like lightning. Edward knelt in front of Annie. "You're right. But sometimes we need to face our fears to protect the people we love." "Then go," Annie said, smiling. "But go with love, not with anger." Edward kissed the girl's forehead and walked determinedly to the central square. he found Sergio surrounded by at least a dozen journalists, talking about necessary medical intervention and protection of shareholder assets. "Sergio," Edward called, approaching the group. An immediate silence fell. All cameras turned to Edward, who for the first time in weeks felt completely in control of himself and his decisions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," he began, addressing the cameras directly. "My name is Edward Barrett, and I came to Harmony Creek 2 weeks ago because I was very ill and needed peace to reflect on my life." Sergio tried to interrupt him, but Edward continued. "Here I met extraordinary people who taught me that true success is not measured only in financial numbers, but in the ability to make a positive difference in the lives of other human beings." "Edward, you don't know what you're saying," Sergio whispered. "I know exactly what I'm saying," Edward replied, looking directly at his former partner. "And I also know that you are acting out of fear of losing control. But I will not allow you to turn into a scandal, something that is in fact the most beautiful story I have ever lived." Edward turned back to the cameras. "Here I met a girl named Annie, who lives with a wonderful lady named Mrs. Geraldine. This girl taught me that sometimes the cure we seek comes not only from medicine, but from love, compassion, and purpose in life." "He's clearly unbalanced," Sergio murmured to nearby journalists. "What is unbalanced," Edward continued, raising his voice, "is a system that teaches us that only what we can accumulate matters, not what we can give. I came here sick and selfish, thinking only of my own survival. I will leave here healed and for the first time knowing what my true purpose is." Julia approached with a microphone. "Mr. Barrett, what is that purpose?" Edward smiled, thinking of Annie, the Millers, Mrs. Geraldine, all the simple people of Harmony Creek who had given him lessons in humanity. "My purpose is to use everything I have built throughout my life to make a real difference in people's lives. I will create a foundation dedicated to reuniting separated families, to providing educational opportunities for vulnerable children, and to supporting communities like Harmony Creek, which preserve humanity's most important values." The murmur among the journalists grew. It was a statement that would completely change the narrative of the story. "And what about your companies?" asked another reporter. "My companies will continue to operate normally, generating jobs and creating value. The difference is that now they will also have a clear social purpose." Edward looked at Sergio. "And my former partner is invited to participate in this new phase, if he can understand that true success includes social responsibility." Sergio stared at him for long seconds, clearly processing the implications of what Edward had said. Finally, he shook his head. "You've completely changed." "I have," Edward agreed. "For the better." It was then that something unexpected happened. Annie appeared in the square accompanied by her grandparents and Mrs. Geraldine. She walked directly to Edward, completely ignoring the cameras. "Mr. Edward," she said, "you kept your promise. You found my family. And you kept yours," he replied. "You cured me of a disease I didn't even know I had, the disease of living without purpose." Annie smiled and turned to the cameras. "Do you want to know if I really cure people?" An expectant silence fell over the square. "I just pray that people find what they need to be happy. Sometimes it's health, sometimes it's family, sometimes it's just the courage to change. God decides the rest." Lucy approached and put her hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "And we decided that our family now includes not only Annie, but also Mrs. Geraldine, who raised her with so much love." "Will you live together?" a journalist asked. "We will discover together the best way to be a family," Mrs. Geraldine replied. "The important thing is that no one will be alone anymore." Edward observed the scene with a sense of completeness he had never experienced. His promise had been fulfilled in a way that surpassed his most optimistic expectations. Annie had not only found her biological family, but had created an extended family based on love and mutual care. In the days that followed, Edward remained in Harmony Creek, finalizing the details of his new foundation, which would be based right there, bringing economic development to the region without destroying its essence. Sergio, after long conversations, decided to embark on the new project, recognizing that perhaps he too needed a greater purpose in his life. Annie was officially registered as Anna Helen Miller Santos, honoring both her biological mother and Mrs. Geraldine. The Millers built a house next to Mrs. Geraldine's, creating a unique family arrangement that respected all of the girls' emotional bonds. And about Helen Christine? 3 months later, she called her parents' house after seeing a television report about the reunion. She was alive, living in a small town in rural Florida, where she had rebuilt her life after years of struggling with postpartum depression that had prevented her from raising her daughter. The complete family reunion was even more emotional than the first. Edward returned regularly to Harmony Creek, no longer as a billionaire fleeing his problems, but as a man who had found his true calling. His medical exams continued to show progressive improvement, something science never fully explained, but which Edward stopped questioning. On his last day of that first visit, Edward sat on the park bench where it had all begun. Annie approached, as always, with her silent wisdom. "Mr. Edward, can I ask you a question?" "Always." "Do you still believe it was my prayer that cured you?" Edward thought carefully about the answer. "I believe your prayer opened my heart to receive the healing I truly needed. The cure for loneliness, for selfishness, for a meaningless life. The rest, well, sometimes miracles happen in ways we cannot fully understand." Annie smiled and ran off to play with other children. Edward watched her, knowing that he had witnessed something much greater than a simple story of physical healing. He had witnessed the transformative power of unconditional love, true family, and purpose in life. That night, before heading back to New York City, Edward wrote in his personal diary, "I came to Harmony Creek looking for a cure for my illness. I found a cure for my entire life. I promised to find Annie's parents. She helped me find the man I should have been all along. Some promises, when fulfilled, end up transforming everyone involved in unimaginable ways." End of story. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Edward, Annie, and the Miller family has touched your hearts as much as it touched ours. This is a story about second chances, about the transformative power of love, and about how sometimes the greatest healings happen when we least expect them. To continue this emotional journey with us, we have prepared a special playlist with equally touching stories that explore the mysteries of the human heart. You can find it by clicking the link next to this video. If this story awakened any emotion in you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video. Every day we bring narratives that celebrate the human capacity for transformation and hope. Don't miss our next content and tell us in the comments, do you believe in the power of prayer and love to heal not only the body, but especially the soul? We look forward to seeing you in our next story.